the law that explains the Second Amendment. History doesn't always change through battles or declarations. Sometimes it changes quietly through a single document that tells you exactly how power thinks. In January of 1776, months before independence was even declared, the Continental Congress issued something almost no American today could name: the Tory Act. It wasn't long, it wasn't poetic, it wasn't written for textbooks. It was written for authority, and buried in its simple language was a blueprint that every constitutionalist in 2026 should recognize. How governments classify dissent, how they separate the obedient from the dangerous, and how disarmament shifts from theory to policy. The Tory Act wasn't about muskets, it was about power, and it reveals why the Second Amendment exists and why it was designed to cover all bearable arms, not just the ones the government approves of. Before we start, make sure you're subscribed so you actually see these updates when they happen. This stuff moves fast, and missing one story changes the whole picture. Section 1. Two Americas before America. We often imagine 1776 as a unanimous moment: fireworks, signatures, unity, and resolved purpose. But the reality was closer to 2026 than most people want to admit. Colonial America was already split into two political cultures. On one side were constitutionalist colonists who believed rights existed before the government, and that government was merely a manager of those rights. On the other side were central power advocates, people who valued order, authority, and structure, even under a distant king. Sound familiar? It should, because that divide never disappeared. It kept reappearing in the Civil War debates, in the New Deal era, in the Cold War, in the post-9/11 era, and now again in the digital surveillance age. Key takeaways. America has always been divided by views of power. One side believes rights pre-exist government. The other believes rights are granted by the government. The Second Amendment makes no sense without this philosophical split. Section 2. What the Tory Act actually said. On January 2, 1776, the Continental Congress issued instructions for how to deal with a very specific group: Americans who didn't agree with the revolution. They weren't British soldiers, they were fellow colonists. The act divided them into two categories. Category 1, the misinformed. These people were described as honest and well-meaning but deceived. Congress recommended explanations, education, persuasion, and patience. The message was, they can still be brought into the fold if guided properly. Category 2, the dangerous. These were labeled unworthy of national loyalty. Their crime wasn't violence, it was dissent against the revolutionary project itself. And the recommended solution wasn't debated. It was disarmament, custody, and bonds for good behavior. That's not an argument, that's state power. Key takeaways. The act defined political disagreement as a category of threat. The response escalated from persuasion to force. The final tool wasn't speech, it was disarmament. Section 3. The original playbook for disarmament. The Tory Act reveals something governments instinctively understand. Before you can control people, you must first control their capacity to resist. And the fastest way to do that is to define a political group as a security problem. Step 1. Call them misinformed. Step 2. Call them dangerous. Step 3. Disarm them in the name of safety. Step 4. Enforce compliance through custody or punishment. Step 5. Justify it as necessary for the greater good. Modern governments follow this same pattern from 20th century Europe to Cold War regimes to modern extremism frameworks used by intelligence agencies. Under the Biden DOJ, people with St. Michael iconography, Gadsden flags, or simple constitutional slogans were categorized as security interests. What changes over time isn't the playbook, just the vocabulary. Section 4. Why the Second Amendment exists. The founders didn't write the Second Amendment to protect duck hunters, competition shooters, or hobbyists. They wrote it because they lived through a world where political dissenters were categorized, disarmed, and detained in the name of stability. James Madison wrote that the advantage of being armed distinguished Americans from Europeans, where governments feared trusting the people with arms. Tench Coxe called every terrible implement of the soldier a birthright. George Mason said the militia consisted of the whole people. This wasn't theory, it was architecture. The Second Amendment is part of the same structural framework as federalism, separation of powers, and due process. It divides power horizontally and vertically, so no single actor can monopolize force. Key takeaways. The Second Amendment is structural, not symbolic. Its purpose is to keep power distributed. Arms belong to the people because power belongs to the people. Section 5. All bearable arms means all bearable arms. One of the most misunderstood elements of modern gun policy debates is the category of arms. Modern commentators treat arms as if they were sporting tools or narrow recreational equipment. But to the founding generation, arms meant something very different. the implements of a free citizen capable of resisting force. The phrase bearable arms has a direct historical meaning. Bearable does not mean ornamental, and it does not mean limited to technologies politicians prefer. It means any weapon an individual can carry for defense, duty, or resistance. This interpretation isn't fringe, and it isn't a modern invention. It's documented in the ratification debates. Tench Coxe famously wrote that Congress had no authority to disarm the militia, describing their swords and every other terrible implement of the soldier as a birthright. That line is devastating to contemporary gun control ideology because it collapses the entire argument that military-style arms fall outside Second Amendment protection. If anything, the founding-era logic works in reverse. The more militarily irrelevant an arm is, the more constitutionally protected it becomes. Because the point was never recreation, it was a balance of power. Key takeaways. Arms meant implements of both defense and resistance. Founders explicitly included military-grade implements. Civilian arms can't be limited to politically approved tools. The Second Amendment works only if force cannot be monopolized. Section 6. When politics becomes security. The most dangerous shift in any republic is not when people disagree, but when disagreement becomes relabeled as a security threat. The Tory Act is a perfect case study. The moment dissent became synonymous with danger, debate ended, and policy began. Governments rarely begin with force. They begin with language. First you categorize, then you isolate, then you justify, and only then do you act. In 1776, that meant labeling certain Americans as unworthy and recommending they be disarmed for the supposed safety of the whole. That rhetorical pattern survived the centuries. It's the same framing used in modern administrative language about dangerous extremism, high-risk categories, or public safety threats. Once those labels appear, rights become negotiable and political dissent becomes an enforcement question. Key takeaways. Safety language is often a powerful language. Classification precedes restriction. Political dissent becomes a security category. Section 7. Disarm the Opposition. One of the most revealing sentences in the Tory Act is not the classification of dissenters, but the prescribed remedy: they ought to be disarmed. And for those deemed more dangerous, the Act recommended confinement or sureties for good behavior. This tells us something essential about power. Once a government identifies a political faction as illegitimate, the remedy is rarely debate. It is restriction, and the first restriction is usually forced. The founders lived this reality. They watched a political dispute become a security dispute, and then a security dispute become a force dispute. Once dissenters are reframed as risks, disarmament becomes common sense to those in charge. And this logic did not disappear after 1776. It resurfaces every time a government claims extraordinary authority in the name of public safety, national security, or extremism. Disarmament is justified not as punishment, but as prevention of a subtle but catastrophic difference. Key takeaways. Disarmament is the state's preferred response to dissent. The Second Amendment was written as an answer to that habit. Political disagreements become security problems. Section 8. Armed citizens matter. James Madison's brilliance in Federalist 46 was not theoretical. It was structural. He contrasted America with Europe and said foreign governments feared trusting their people with arms. America was different precisely because it trusted its citizens. That trust created a balance of power. Armed citizens prevented centralized authority from becoming the only source of force inside society. And when force is monopolized at the center, checks and balances become symbolic instead of practical. The founders did not intend the Second Amendment as a hobby clause. They viewed it as part of the constitutional architecture, just as essential as the separation of powers, federalism, and free speech. A republic is stable when no institution can dominate the others. That includes the government itself. Armed citizens ensure that political power cannot become military power without resistance. This is why the founding generation repeatedly described the militia as the people. It collapses the modern claim that arms belong to the state. The state does not check itself, the people do. Key takeaways. Armed citizens are part of the constitutional design, not a cultural tradition. The Second Amendment prevents force from centralizing. A free society needs distributed power, not permission-based power. Section 9. The modern divide. When you look at 2026 America through this historical lens, the pattern becomes unmistakable. We are not divided along simple partisan lines, we are divided along constitutional lines. One side sees rights as pre-existing the state, fixed, non-negotiable, and placed beyond majority preference. The other side sees rights as flexible, managed, licensed, and compatible with growing central authority. Once those views collide, the Tory Act logic reappears. First, you are uninformed, then you are dangerous. Then your ability to resist becomes the issue. The modern mechanism is softer hearings, regulations, labels, classifications, watch lists, high-risk categories, but the trajectory is identical. The moment dissent becomes a governance problem, the conversation shifts from persuasion to control. This is why the debate over the Second Amendment is not really about firearms. It is about whether citizens remain capable or merely compliant. Capability implies choice. Compliance implies permission. Key takeaways. America is divided between rights as limits and rights as permissions. Once dissent is securitized, restriction becomes justified. The Second Amendment debate is ultimately a debate about capacity. Section 10. Why this was never about muskets. One of the laziest modern arguments against the Second Amendment is that it was written for muskets. But the people who wrote the Second Amendment had just fought a war against the most powerful military on Earth. Using privately owned arms that were technologically comparable to the British regulars, they understood that technology evolves, but power remains constant. They wrote the amendment for the category of arms, not the model of arms. They were not trying to freeze history, they were trying to preserve a balance of force across time. This is why the founding evidence references terrible implements of the soldier, swords, rifles, pistols, and implements of war, not sporting goods. The Second Amendment protects the tools necessary to resist force, not the tools that make politicians comfortable. Key takeaways. The Second Amendment protects categories, not technologies. The founders expected evolution in arms. A right that shrinks with technology is not a right. The forgotten warning. The Tory Act of 1776 is not famous, but it explains the Second Amendment better than half the modern commentary. It shows how fast political disagreement becomes security policy, how quickly security policy becomes disarmament, and how easily disarmament becomes detention. The founders didn't answer that pattern with trust. They answered it with structure. They limited government, divided power, and ensured the people retained the means to resist force. And that's the point modern America is being trained to forget. The right to keep and bear arms is not a cultural symbol. It is a constitutional safeguard, one that covers all bearable arms because liberty requires capability. If you understand that, you understand why the Second Amendment exists. And if you forget it, the Tory Act is waiting to remind you.